thing, and kind of got started into evolution. Where we got, I'll kind of recap what we talked about as the idea, and again, I'm going to apologize up front. My slides, I like made them nice and colorful for my computer. They're not so so easy to see on here, but I'll make sure I get the information on it. I talk about it over if you can't read it very well. What we talked about, so we'll start at the beginning, when life starts forming on our Earth, according to the secular model. So supposedly what we talked about was the mainstream thought is that at some point, the Earth is just rock and water, and there's no plant life because there's no life. Plants are life. So some puddle somewhere. So I guess my picture is incorrect. I have leaves in there, and they wouldn't be existing at this time. But somewhere in a mud puddle is where they have to have all of the elements, all of the components of RNA. And so and they know that stuff wouldn't go together, so we must have a lightning strike in the puddle, and that just put them all together magically. And you have RNA. RNA gives way to DNA, gives way to proteins, gives way to cells, and now we have life forming. So this just talked about how a rock hitting our Earth, exploding, provided the atmosphere for the biological, I'm not trying to say, the biological molecules to form. So, and this is, I think, about the last slide we got to. Just want to rephrase. So this is Robert Service. So this is a very renowned atheist, the new atheist movement, guys. And he says, life as we know it likely emerged from an RNA world. Many researchers agree. In modern cells, DNA, RNA, and proteins play vital roles. DNA stores variable information. So DNA is the instruction manual for you, right? RNA ferries it inside the cell. So the RNA is what copies it, makes use of it, it does things with it. Different types of RNAs. And then there are proteins that serve as chemical workhorses. The proteins move it all around. They're like the guys that throw the RNA on the back, carry it over to copy the DNA, and then take it where it needs to go. You need all these things to function. So it says, the production of each of those biomolecules requires the other two. Yet the idea that all three complex molecules arose simultaneously seems implausible. I just contend at the bottom there, it's impossible, is a better word than impossible. But the idea is they don't really know how to struggle with this because they know that it's impossible that somehow everything came together to make RNA, DNA, and all these proteins that they need. It's not just one protein, they need lots of proteins to do this stuff. All of it came together is just not possible. So, well, maybe just the one, because the RNA it copies and basically makes the DNA. And so really that's the one we need, because then the DNA can go to the proteins, but then where were the proteins to move the RNA around to make a DNA, or to copy the DNA, and what DNA was around to copy, because the RNA is not the instruction manual, the DNA is. The DNA needs the RNA. The RNA is what makes the DNA work, but none of them work alone. You have to have all three. The other problem they have is, let's say you had all three. Let's say all three spontaneously combusted just because it got shot by lightning. It's not going to survive without a cell to protect it. The cell's not going to survive without all of the organelles within the cell. So you can't just zap RNA to life and get life. You'd have to zap the entire cell to life somehow. So this is, please bear with me, I've got about 3 slides of genetic stuff, and just so I can make a point here at the end, okay, I want you guys to understand the process. So DNA, everybody's kind of seen a double helix, right? Picture of a double helix, the way DNA forms. The way DNA, I'm trying to say copies itself, the way it makes new DNA is it basically unravels. You have little pieces of RNA that come in, so like the red is the new stuff, it's RNA. It's attaching, it can only, with each of these little things are little nucleotides, only certain ones will fit together. So if, let's say, an adenene's sitting up here, the only thing that can attach to it is a guanine. So by what the DNA has, your RNA knows exactly what to copy, so that now this red line is an exact copy of the blue line down here. And this red line down here is an exact copy of the blue line up here. So now you have 2 identical strands of DNA. And basically what you got going on is when that DNA unzips, this is one strand unzipping, the dark blue up here is the DNA, and dark blue on the bottom DNA, and blue stuff, the lighter blue is RNA coming in. You have these little proteins that are shuttling that RNA, putting pieces in, copying the DNA as it goes. There's this little picture of what it might kind of look like, a little graphic. So, like with this, the telomerase is the protein we're talking about, one of the proteins. And it goes along the DNA strand. So blue here is the DNA strand, and it puts RNA in place, and it's creating a new strand, basically. And so then what that does is it makes our chromosomes. And this is what most everybody sees. This is what we pass on for our genes, right? The DNA is all located inside the chromosomes. Chromosomes get passed on. They're big groups of DNA. Main thing with these, so that I want to point out, and we'll need to know a little bit later, is these telomeres. So, or telomeres, I've heard it pronounced both ways. I've always said telomeres. So telomeres are specific DNA protein structures found at both ends of each chromosome. So they are down here, and they're also up there. They protect the genome from nucleolytic degeneration, unnecessary recombination, they repair, and they protect from interchromosomal fusion. Telomeres therefore play a vital role in preserving the information in our genome. That's what I want everybody to remember right now. The telomeres are there to preserve the information. Make sure the information is good. Make sure that mutation doesn't get out of control. Telomeres get used up. As they get used up, they get shorter because they get used up, they plug holes, right? They get shorter and shorter until every time you copy the DNA, the telomeres also get copied. But each time they get copied, they get shorter and shorter. So the telomere tail is shortening, shortening, shortening. Pretty soon it's copying along and there's nothing, no telomere left to copy. But what happens then, because there's no defense against mutation? The cell will undergo apoptosis, which is programmed cell death. The cell knows when that telomere's gone, and it kills itself so it won't replicate. So when it no longer has the defense against mutation, it just kills itself. So it will not mutate because it knows it's going to cause mutation if it keeps mutating. So we have this built-in mechanism to stop mutation. It's not perfect. We still get some mutations, but the point moving forward is just know that your DNA, we were built with a mechanism to stop mutation, prevent it, to hide it as best we can. And when we can't do it anymore, those cells die. Therefore, we age. Your cells can only reproduce so many times. That's not the only mechanism of aging, but it is one of the key mechanisms of aging, is your cells can only replicate so many times because telomeres disappear. So I'll kind of fly through this one, because like this one was old. I made those last three to kind of replace it. But just remember that this is the main key here. This will come up again a couple times. Telomeres are on the ends of your DNA. They're there to help hide mutation, because mutation is going to happen every time it copies. Basically, you know, with these little nucleotides there, and the yellow stuff is the RNA going in, every once in a while they'll leave a hole. You know what I mean? They'll miss one. So now there's this guanine sitting there, doesn't have an adenine attached to it. There's a little book that's like a zipper, and you broke the little one piece out of the zipper. There's your mutation. And so those telomeres go hide that. And so, and small things, your DNA is so long, so complex, we can handle the little things. It's the bigger things that get to be an issue. But this is the main thing I want to remember, is just that there are a thing called telomeres. They are there to hide and help mask mutations. And when you can no longer use them, the cells kill themselves because they do not want to. That's an improper statement. They kill themselves so they cannot replicate very poorly. So the idea that I guess, does anybody have any questions? Sorry, I'm going to try to go a little bit slower than I've gone the last couple weeks. But yeah.
So, like if it did mutate, would that be like, is that how we're getting cancer and things like that?
The cancer is typically, yes, there's mutation involved with cancer, yes.
Okay.
A lot of our genetic diseases are because mutation occurred. And that's a point that we'll get to too. Mutation, when it happens, is always bad. You know, we don't have an example of a mutation leading to, you know, now I can shoot laser beams from my eyes. You know, I'm not super strong because of my mutation. I can't walk through walls. That's not what mutation does. And mutation doesn't, it's random. So it is not, well, random to a certain degree. You can't just choose that, you know, oh, I want those longer legs, and go mate, and pretty soon you have longer legs, you can do that. And so mutation doesn't work the way you need it to for natural selection. But so I think we actually did talk about this slide when I got to here. This is a creationist, a guy by the name of Fred Hoyle. So again, he is going to be biased toward creation. But his numbers, there's no way to prove it, but his numbers just going to kind of make a point. It might not be exactly accurate, but it does make a valid point. So Fred Hoyle, he did some calculations on the likelihood that a hypothetical minimum cell could just spontaneously combust, right? So his thought was the simplest cell that we know of is a little bacterium, and it's got somewhere around 2,000 different proteins. You have to understand too, proteins are massive molecules of all kinds of different elements, different compounds. So proteins are massive in themselves, but he's saying a cell could probably, well, the simplest one we know of has about 2,000 proteins. He theorized or hypothesized that we could probably have a cell that could live with just about 400 proteins. So he's talking about the simplest cell we could possibly make. So he's giving some benefit of the doubt to the spontaneous combustion argument. He's trying anyway. Because a 400 protein cell is much less complex than a 2,000 protein cell, right? So he's trying to figure out then what is the likelihood that if we put all of the ingredients together that a 400 protein cell needs to exist, if we put it all together and we put a little petri dish, try to give it everything it needs to try to get it to go together and make a cell, what are the odds that could actually happen? And what he has come up with, and I've not found any arguments to go against, is he is saying that the odds of a cell just spontaneously combusting, given all of the pieces it needs, is about 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. Try to put that number into perspective for you. The Mega Millions was huge this last couple of days, right? And the Channel 7 News put up a little statement of what the odds of winning the lottery are. Their number was the odds of winning the Mega Millions lotto is about 1 in 302.6 million. That number written like that is about 1 in 3 to 10 to the 8th power. So 10 to the 8th is our chances of winning the Mega Millions. We're talking about 10 to the 40,000 being the odds of a cell going to get the simplest cell we could think of. So just to kind of put that perspective again, there is no way to say that 40,000 is a perfect number. There's no way it is. But it kind of gets a point across that the problem is if you put all these, let's say you go with this cell, 400 proteins, if you put them in a petri dish or put them all together in whatever environment to see if they'll spontaneously combust, most of those are incompatible, which means kind of like oil and water. I think I might have made that example last week. If you have a glass of water, pour some oil in it and stir it up, the oil is going to separate and come to the top. The water is going to go to the bottom because they're not compatible. They try to run away from each other. That's what a lot of the molecules, most of the molecules in the cell would do. They're just left their own vices. There's also a bunch of them that would chemically react, which means if they chemically react, you put two materials together and react them, you come up with a new material. And that material wouldn't necessarily be conducive to a cell. So the idea that you can just have all these materials in the same location and let them form a cell is really just ludicrous. It'd make my job as a chemist a lot easier if you could do that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So then, what'll come up in school and stuff, they'll ask, well, what about cloning? We can create, we know how to make life, we know how to take these building blocks and make life. So let's talk about cloning, just real quick. Cloning is not creating anything. Cloning is a poor version of copying. It's basically taking life, trying to give it the things it needs to nurture it and grow it, and sometimes barely making that happen. So what it is, and this is straight out of the NHGRI / the National Human Genome Research Institute. So this is their own document. You can get this online if you go to their website, genome.gov. So basically, you have your animal that you want to clone. You take from it some skin cells, either mast cells or stem cells of some kind. Like your skin, I don't know if you guys know this, the basal skin cells, the stuff at the bottom of your layer of your skin, those we call them mast cells, are basically a type of stem cell. They have the ability to come, as your skin ages, your dead skin sloughs off and goes away and you get new skin underneath, those cells have the ability to become all the different cell types in your skin. So basically, your top layer of skin sloughs off, the next layer moves up, becomes the same kind of skin that was on top of it. These cells are different. And so you have skin cells that have the ability to become whatever those skin cells need to be. And it turns out they can become all kinds of other cells too. So they take those because those cells, the mast cells or stem cells, they have the ability to become other types of cells. Then they just find some female of the same animal type. They take an egg, and this little graphic shows a knife. They cut the DNA out. Basically do it chemically. It's not a knife. You can't take a razor blade and cut DNA. But they chemically remove the DNA. They kill the DNA, basically, is a better word for it. So it can't, there's no genetic information out in this egg. It has everything it needs to nurture if other sperm or gametes meet it, but it doesn't have its own genetic information. So now you only have the genetic information of the host, or the one you want to clone. So then you take some of those cells, you take the egg, and you try to get them to fuse together. They'll use electric equipment to do that. I wonder if that's where they got the idea that lightning striking a puddle could create life. I don't know, that's my own hypothesis, but they basically try to get those to fuse, and if they get them to fuse, and this is countless trials, try and fail, and eventually they'll sometimes get this to happen. And when that happens, then they can watch it and it will start dividing. It will start copying itself. And when that starts to happen, they get a bunch of them, then they put it back into a female surrogate. So basically they have just fertilized their own egg with genetic information of only one of the animals. And they still need the same kind of animal to raise it, to nurture it. And then when it's born, it's called a clone because it is an exact copy of that one, because the only genetic information is from that one. So by genome, it's an exact copy. So what are the problems with this? I don't know how many of you guys have heard of Dolly. Dolly was, I keep wanting to say a pig, it's a sheep. I don't know why, that's probably because I keep seeing graphics like that one. But, Dolly, they got to survive. Dolly was a clone. Dolly was one of 277, and that is 277 they got this to happen correctly. They would have tried getting that to happen countless times to get the 277. But they got 277 of those to start multiplying, start dividing, start copying themselves, that they tried to put back into a host parent, host mother. And then they got Dolly. So Dolly was born very large, a little bit older, looked like Dolly had aged already and such. And we're going to talk about why. But the thing with cloning, I'd like to tell you, so, and all this stuff is directly also at that same site, the genome people. So researchers have observed some adverse health effects in sheep and other mammals that have been cloned. These include an increase in birth size, a variety of defects in vital organs such as livers fail, brain, heart. Other consequences include premature aging and problems with the immune system. There's a very good reason for this, and we'll talk about that. Another potential problem centers on the relative age of cloned cells' chromosomes. And this actually is going to answer why they have premature aging. So as cells go through their normal rounds of division, the tips of the chromosomes called telomeres shrink. Over time, the telomeres become so short that the cell can no longer divide, and consequently the cell dies, which is apoptosis. This is a part of the natural aging process that seems to happen in all cell types. It does. As a consequence, clones created from a cell taken from an adult might have chromosomes that are already shorter than normal, which making them the clone's cells to shorter lifespan. Do you guys understand that? Dolly was born old because the telomeres they were copying were gone. In their minds, it should have gone just like when sperm meets egg, right? But for some reason, when sperm meets egg, the telomeres are brand new in the new organism. When they clone, they're not. Why they're brand new? These guys don't have a clue yet. So, new life form, you got brand new telomeres. A copied life form, you don't. They're the same one. So basically, they just take a cell that can already create new life, give it the environment it needs, and they're not creating a cell that has the ability to build itself into life again. So kind of like you cut the tail off some lizards, their tail can grow back. Stem cells, not quite the same, but same kind of concept. So indeed, Dolly, who was cloned from the cell of a 6-year-old sheep, had chromosomes that were shorter than those of other sheep her age. Dolly died when she was 6 years old, about half the average sheep's 12-year lifespan. So sheep that she was cloned from was 6 years old, and only lived 12 years. She lived 6 because she only had half her telomeres left. The other thing that they don't really talk about here is the medical attention Dolly needed to survive that long. She did have failing organs. There was all kinds of problems. They cloned a few animals since, and it's all the same story. They die prematurely. They have to keep them nursing to keep them alive because their organs are failing them. They just have all kinds of problems. So, yes, we figured out how to take a stem cell that already exists, give it some nurturing, try to get it to procreate or just grow, whatever you want to call it. We figured that out, but it doesn't work well. It never ends well, and that's not going to change. And it takes so many trials to get just one thing to go successfully. So nothing that we have perfected, nothing we ever will perfect, and even if we do, it is not creating life. Nothing was created here. The cells just did their job. So, if life can't spontaneously combust, we can't create it, where does it come from? Well, the Bible tells us in Colossians 1:16, for by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. Now, the secular people are going to say, it's all nice magical stuff, and I would say, well, give me a better explanation. Because you're not even close to one. So, but secular, and they'll also come back from that and say, well, given enough time, anything's possible, right? This next slide is my favorite quote I've ever found. It was by a guy by the name of George Wald. George Wald, I can't quote the year, I think it was like 67. He was one of 3 recipients of a Nobel Peace Prize for his work on, he was an eye guy, an eye doctor. He developed some type of new surgery for the eyeball. I don't remember the exact details, but he says this, that time is in fact the hero of the plot. The time with which we have to deal is of the order of 2 billion years. Now, he was around a while ago, right? I told you guys that our solar system is 4.5 billion years old. In George Wald's time, we were only 2 billion years old. We just had to add 2.5 billion years since George Wald was around. So we're aging very fast. So it says, what we regard as impossible on the basis of the human experience is meaningless here. So what we know to be reality doesn't mean anything if you have enough time. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible, the possible probable, and the probable virtually certain. One has only to wait. Time itself performs miracles. So let's follow that logic to its reasonable conclusion here. So everything that was impossible just 2+ billion years ago has now certainly happened. It doesn't seem like I've seen that. But does it also, well, let me ask you too, if we waited around, what's something impossible? The chairs growing wings and flying out of the building. That's impossible, but give them time, and it will definitely happen because given enough time, the impossible is certain. This was a guy smart enough to create a surgery on your eyeball. But they want to accept this because they have to accept it. And also now, do we understand their obsessive need for a multiverse to exist? Because that also explains that everything that can happen has happened. So what does this mean? Yeah, so I'd like to ask a second person this. I haven't ever done it yet, haven't thought about it, but what does that mean for God? Because they tell me that God's impossible. So what does that mean given enough time? God absolutely exists by their logic. And I just I think I have this quote here a couple times in my presentation. I like this one: the way of a fool is right in his own eyes. That's Proverbs 12:15. There's more to it. It says, but a wise man listens to advice. I like the first half of it. So, way of a fool is right in his own eyes. What we think is right to us. And that's all I can do to explain why some of these very, very smart people just buy into some of this stuff. So, we're going to talk about secular need for time. We'll talk about timeline real quick here. This is, I know you can't see any of this, and trust me, it's not necessarily, I'll just talk about the main points in the timeline. 13.8 billion years ago, our universe began, right here. 4.5 billion years ago, our solar system formed, and that is right here on this timeline. 3.9 billion years ago is when they say that RNA first combusted, beginning life. So that's when the lightning struck the mud puddle, made the RNA, and life starts forming. 443 billion years ago, I'm sorry, 443 million years ago, the first mass extinction event occurs, which is an ice age. Then they take life through about 3 more ice age extinction events before, and this is while life is still just single cell organisms. So we don't have the life that we know as life. These are single cell organisms. They start to proliferate, and the ice age kills them off. And they start to proliferate, and the ice age kills them off. And this is just a need for the secular model. They need to have this pattern. Yeah, so up to this point, to this 443 million years ago, there is no evidence. This is storytelling because there's no fossils. And I'll still contend they date fossils incorrectly. We'll get to that later. But even stuff to work on incorrectly, they don't have. They have nothing. This is all storytelling. Just it has to happen to fit the model. And then 225 million years ago, the Cambrian explosion occurs. What the Cambrian explosion is, if you start back at 3.9 billion years ago, life is building like this, right? And then all of a sudden, in a very tiny short time, it goes boom. Everything we know of as life, the vast majority of all the phyla that we have now were created, according to their timeline, pretty much overnight. So, which tends to look to me like maybe a creation event, but, and then 66 million years ago, the meteor hits the Earth, dinosaurs all die out. 47 million years ago, another ice age hits us. That's how they explain away what they see presented to a flood. They use this last ice age. And then 250,000 years ago, our first human comes from a chimpanzee. Humanity is born. So this is their timeline in a nutshell. Oh, geez, that came away now. Just trying to find, and pretty much everybody here is an adult. I asked this was more for when I did the Awanas group. I wanted to know if anybody knew what that was. See if the kids knew what the phone was. The basics of this one is just this kind of outline where we're going to move forward into evolution now. How they're going to try to attest to their time frame and get their story told. They're going to use phylogenetic trees. You guys have seen those where you have this animal became these animals and this one became these ones. And we'll talk about those. They use natural selection. Superposition and paraconformity are geological things, and we'll talk about those. Fossils and radiometric dating, and that's where we'll end evolution when we get to radiometric dating. So sorry, that was a really bad slide. And this one too, I apologize, this is copying terrible. It's not just your eyes, those are very blurry words. You're not going to be able to read them. The point to this though is this is a typical phylogenetic tree. It's a real tiny little piece of one. You'll see your animal here. This animal becomes this one and that one there. And the animal that's here will become that one and that one, that will become these two. What I like to point out with this phylogenetic tree is that you'll notice they have an animal name here. They have an animal name here. They've got one for this stage back here where you can't see yet. But there's all these stages where they don't have an animal to give you. They don't have a transition. That's what their typical phylogenetic tree looks like right now. They don't have these transition animals. They make their own puzzle pieces here. They assume what the animal had to have been to then become their animals. So even if you try putting their puzzle together, you've all seen the posters of little tiny animal becomes this one, becomes this one, becomes this one, becomes that, and now suddenly you have humans. The problem is with that, those trees are horribly incomplete. They're not even worth making at this point. So a creationist view, if the secular person starts saying, well, yeah, but look at them, you can see the common traits. You can see how this one it adds up, how they went this direction. And you can just see it visually. You can see common traits. This one has common traits with this one, and this one has more common traits, and this one has more common traits. Well, let's think about it. You know, if you guys all think about maybe your favorite band or your favorite music group, favorite singer, right? If a new song by that person or that group came out today, would you recognize that group or that singer before they told you who it was? More than likely, right? And why would that be? Because there's familiarity, right? And a lot of their songs have familiarity. They're songs they could have slow songs up to fast songs. But you still kind of recognize they're like a signature, an artistic signature, I guess. You kind of know what you're listening to. Well, that may be kind of similar to, we all have one creator, no matter what animal you are on this planet. If we have one creator, there's going to be common traits. At least that makes sense to me. So, to me, seeing the similarities from one to the next is a result of a common creator. And you know, these phylogenetic trees, the creationists will also tell you, they're just not fair to use because they don't have enough information to really even stand up. So, phylogenetic trees, they paint a nice picture, they make a nice poster, but they really don't have any useful information in them. Move on to natural selection. So natural selection is the idea that organisms select mates with favorable traits, right? The peacock here, the female's gonna go find the male with the biggest tail, coolest tail, can squawk the loudest, and because in theory, they want their gametes to pass on and be another big, powerful bird, right? So that then means that organisms with unfavorable traits are selected not to continue evolution. So does that make sense? If I'm going to go pick the kind of person that I want my children to have those kind of traits to mate with, then, and if that's what everybody's doing, then only those people with favorable traits or animals with favorable traits are going to continue, and the ones that are weak, they're not. Okay, so we got to remember this. Unfavorable traits are selected not to continue. By keeping only favorable traits in the evolutionary tree, evolution drives in favorable directions. For example, and that's what I just talked about, the peacock. The peacock's going to look for the mates that they want their children, their offspring to look like. So one just little side note here, when an organism selects a mate, that is a conscious decision, right? That's not random. And what do we say about a naturalistic world? Everything's random and programmed. There is no decision making, there's no consciousness. So you can't make a decision if the world is randomly made. But moving on, so remember the unfavorable traits we're not going to mate with, right? We don't want the unfavorables. So if natural selection or survival of the fittest could not drive evolution, natural selection or survival of the fittest could not drive evolution forward. If anything, natural selection would act in opposition to evolution. For example, to get from a four-legged lizard creature to a flying creature, which we all seen Jurassic Park, right? The raptors become birds. So to get from the four-legged lizard creature to a flying creature, numerous generations would be required. Hundreds of generations at least. Really, Richard Dawkins would tell you thousands upon tens of thousands. That's why our need for 4 billion years of evolution. So this is not denied. Richard Dawkins agrees with this. You know, they show these trees that look like this, where you have 4 animals and suddenly turkey. You know, it's ridiculous. But, you know, for Dawkins, the faith is we'll eventually understand all the steps. We just don't understand it yet. So the fossil record only shows, 4 or 5 generations from lizard to bird. You know, they supposedly found the fossilist Archaeopteryx, and that linked dinosaurs to birds, supposedly. They backtracked. You haven't heard much about it lately, and there's reasons for that. They backtracked of what they think they actually found. So that's just not how mutation works. So let's think about if it takes maybe let's say 100 generations, 1,000 generations to get from here to here. Let's think about that, what it might really look like. So at some point, the four-legged creature, the four-legged lizard, would have legs that wouldn't run very well. It wouldn't yet be able to fly. It would have a mouth somewhere between teeth and a beak. It would no longer have defensive scale armor, nor would it have developed feathers. So Casey drew this for me. Because scales don't become feathers overnight. You can't mutate a scale into a feather. The scales have to soften, elongate, grow spines. That takes thousands of generations. Teeth and a nice snout on a lizard doesn't become a beak overnight. You know, it takes hundreds upon thousands of generations for that nose to elongate and become a beak. The back legs, you know, birds, the front legs have to become wings, right? So pretty soon they can't support any weight at some point. And at some point, the back legs too are pretty stubby and can't run. So basically at some point in there, you're going to have an animal that could not run, could not fly, could not fight, and could not eat. What is natural selection going to do to that animal? You're going to want to go mate with that animal? Natural selection just weeded this out. It just stopped evolution. Evolution is just as a contradiction in terms. It can't happen. So, creationist view on all this. Within a naturalistic evolutionary view, there is no place for an intelligent driving force for mutation. Mutation is necessary for evolution to move forward, but such mutation must be random. Thus, creatures cannot choose mates with desirable traits, or can choose mates with desirable traits, but cannot purposefully select which traits get passed on to their young. The vast majority of mutations that do occur are bad or possibly neutral. We don't have good mutations. Preferable mutation is very rare. This is why so many generations would be required for a random mutation to drive evolution forward, why secular science requires hundreds of millions of old Earth years. So, you know, just this first statement, I don't know if it makes sense right where I put it, but, you know, DNA formed into groups called genes. Genes form into groups called alleles. Alleles form into groups called chromosomes. So you got a massive amount of information, and you got telomeres hide the mutations. So mutations that really happen are really well masked. There's, I believe they say that they believe that mutation happens every time your cell replicates, every time your DNA replicates, you're gonna have some kind of mutation. But we have a mechanism to hide it, so it's just it doesn't become a problem. But I have a little analogy here for you for what a mutation does. So let's imagine you have an instruction manual to build a 747. All right, that's your genome, that's your DNA, DNA's instruction manual, right? So let's say you take one page out of that instruction manual, cut out every individual word, I really probably should put every individual letter, mix them up, then toss them all into a long line. So randomly mix them all up, toss them in a long line. What are the odds that the words will land in legible order, that you can actually read them? And it makes sense. But beyond that, even if those words make sense, what are the odds that if you follow that instruction now, you improve the 747? You gonna fly in that plane? But that's what DNA mutation is. It's just random mix-up, and then you gotta figure out what are the odds that mix-up is actually gonna be advantageous. Can we really improve a 747 by just randomly tossing out a page or a section, a chapter maybe, and hope that it actually lands on, oh, that's a better idea. You know, it's just ridiculous. So, and then I go back here because I didn't have the telomere stuff in there before when I wrote this slide about how DNA is also armed with that defense against mutation. Strands of DNA have tails of essentially blank information or alleles called telomeres. These telomeres are designed to cover up errors in DNA replication or mutations. If mutation is so important in evolution, then why would telomeres have ever developed? Oh yeah, why is it relevant in a random chance world? So, but just know that we're built with defense against mutation. And when mutation happens, it would actually go the opposite direction of natural selection. Sorry, that slide's kind of irrelevant because I already wrote everything. I should have taken that one out because I added some slides in there a little bit ago. So, any other questions about that's genetics? I got you through that. We're done with genetics, but anybody have any questions about it? So, sorry, I know I'm diving pretty deep, but I got to tend to dive into the chemistries or to the stuff to get the point in the end. So, the point of all that was that 1, mutations are not going to be advantageous. 2, we have defenses against mutations. 3, mutations would act in opposition to natural selection. So all of that is just evolution just can't drive forward doing that stuff. So we'll move on to geology next. what the evidence is in geology. And we only got a few minutes, so I'll just get first a little bit here. But second, people talk about superposition and paraconformity. Superposition is the idea that when you see this rock, see that nice, or see the superposition, there's layers, right? You can see the layering effect of the rock. Paraconformity is the idea, there's the observation that these rock layers are nice and straight, right? They're nice and flat. You see this everywhere. Any canyon you look in, there's some things that are disturbed because of earthquakes or something move rocks around. But for the most part, the layering that we see, they're nice and straight lines. And we're going to talk about why the second people say that's evidence of old Earth, and I'm going to talk about why no, we think it's evidence of a young Earth and a flood. So again, superposition is also part of that, is the idea that when they dig for fossils, they notice smaller, less complex animals here and more complex animals at the top. And so they say, well, the lower layers have to be older, so the animals in them have to be older. The upper layers are newer, so the animals in them are newer. So there's your evidence of evolution. They say that the rock layers form in seasons, like the rings of a tree. I still don't have an answer to what a rock season is, but they'll say certain things like, well, you have ice age events, and that causes different seasons. And each layer, by the way, they're saying is usually thousands or tens or hundreds of thousands of years old, each layer. So a ring on a tree is a year, but they're saying a rock layer, you're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of years between layers. So fossils found in the lower layers must be older than those in the upper layers. The layers must have been laid down over millions of years, typically each layer representing tens of thousands of years. Therefore, fossils in the lower layers must be older than the fossils in the upper layers. And here's your entire physical evidence basis for evolution. I shouldn't say the entire thing, it's not fair, but one of their main arguments, big arguments. So what does the creationists say about what we see in these layers? We see layers like this get laid down overnight in volcanic eruptions. There's also an abundance, and this is a big one, there's abundance of evidence and controlled experiments have shown that layers, such as we see in the Grand Canyon or the Andes canyons, could have formed very rapidly via flood waters runoff. They can get a big bowl, a big tub, fill it with water, put a bunch of dirt in it, right? And you're going to have some dirt that's heavier, some bigger pebbles, right? Some smaller pebbles, and you're going to, if you stir it all up, it will lay down in layers. And you can watch that happen. And then, open a drain, let the water run off, you cut canyons through it like that. And then if that sat there for 1,000 years, it would be hardened rock. So, really there's a lot of evidence saying it was a flood. And now it's got a second of people saying, well, no, the Ice Age must have done that. So, and the other problem here is fossils. If each layer is 10,000 years old, right? We find fossils penetrating layers all the time. So that means, let's say this fish here, his tail is down here and his head's up here. If you've got 10,000 years between layers, that means his head just sat there sticking out of the ground for 10,000 years as it was buried, and nothing happened to it. Didn't erode, didn't decompose. It just sat there waiting to be covered up by the next 10,000 years of layering. So like this is a big one they find. They'll find a tree fossil, and they'll find it go through 5 or 6 layers at least. Some of them a lot more layers than that. If you started burying a tree dies, right? Let's say you bury the trunk this high. What's going to happen to the rest of the tree that's dead, that's sitting up here in the next 100 years? Is much of it going to be there? What about 200 years from now? What about 1,000 years from now? If an animal didn't come and destroy it, or weathering didn't destroy it, it's going to decompose. It is not going to survive from here to here if each layer is even 1,000 years in between, even several hundred. It's not going to do that. So, but we find that all the time. And they'll start figuring out how an ice age might have done that too. But then they'll accept rapid layering, but just for there, just right in that area. The rest of it's all thousands of years layering. So those are kind of arguments that I've seen to try to combat that. What are we going to do? Can I just finish this thought real quick? It'll take about 2 more minutes, and I'll stop then. So So paraconformity then is noticing that these layers are perfectly straight. These nice straight lines of layers all through this. And then yes, I'm just kind of rounding the corner. But and every once in a while I see some that penetrate up, and that usually is there was a rock slide or there was an earthquake or something. But by and large, we all can agree the layers are almost always nice and straight lines. The secular people are telling us that that straight line is evidence of long-term deposition, so tens of thousands of years in between layers. Because they say if it was rapid, there'd be more bioturbation. And what bioturbation is just this idea. This is water. This is not a picture I can find. It's the idea that ground gets disturbed by vegetation and animals and such, right? You're going to have animals digging holes in the ground. You're going to have animals building hills, stuff that's, you're going to have vegetation, tree roots and trees and other plant life that's stirring up the ground, right? And constantly moving the ground around. Yeah, you go out and look at the ground, it's not moving on you right now, but 10,000 years from now, if you could put a video camera on it, let's say for 10,000 years, and then speed it up, you're going to see the ground going all over the place, right? So that's what bioturbation is, the idea that biological organisms, animals, plants, are going to stir the ground up and move it around. So they're saying that the fact that we don't see bioturbation means that they were deposited very, very slowly over tens of thousands of years. I don't understand that. Because isn't bioturbation worse if the ground is not layered, if it's layered slowly? Because if there's 10,000 years before the next layer forms, how many animals are going to be destroying that ground? How many plants are going to grow on there and die and grow again and die and grow again and die? If they were done slowly, they'd be all over the place. I don't think we'd even see layers. But this is one of those places where I don't know what to tell you either, because I've just been in an impasse with people. They absolutely say that these nice paraconformity means slow deposition. I absolutely say it means very fast deposition. I don't see their point, they don't see mine. I don't think there's a break somewhere there. But to me, those nice straight lines, we've seen it in a lab, it makes sense. If you fly in an airplane, next time you guys are in an airplane, you're flying over really most anywhere, but Utah, Arizona, these are awesome places to see this. You can see the flood runoff. You can see where water had been built up and ran off. It is so obvious when you look at it. But they'll say, well, no, it was a whole system of rivers and streams that have cut in different directions over millions of years. And there again, we need those millions of years because it could not happen otherwise. So I think we'll end it there because we'll talk about just kind of fossils made analogous and radiometric dating. And that, I apologize, that one might be even a little more thick than the genetic stuff, but we'll get through it. And then after that, we'll get into, so I'm hoping I can have 2 more days, and not just one. We'll get into, so next week I want to do radiometric dating, and that one might take us pretty much the whole time. And then we'll get into what dinosaurs and what a worldwide flood means to the 2 different models, the creation model and the naturalism model. So yeah, we'll wrap it up with that. I did want to let you guys know, got my hands on a few copies of this book. This is a book that really, and they're back there. I've got 5 or 6 in here. I've got access to more if anybody wants them. I really hope that any of you that have children or grandchildren that might be going into high school or college, please take one. I've got them and not going anywhere else. So if you guys have any interest in it, what this book is, it's called Censored Science. Bruce Malone's the author. He just went through, and this is basically what I'm doing. He's got a bunch of, they're just little excerpts of, he's got a bunch on biology, a bunch on geology, a bunch on cosmology. So basically what I've been doing, going through the biology of it, going through the geology of it, going through the cosmology, the Big Bang stuff, and just making nice analogies so you can understand. It's like the people are asking you to accept this. Here's an analogy. Here's what they're really trying to ask you to accept and put it into plain terms. And so it's nice because most of what your kids are going to get in school and try to tell you this is how it is, you can give an analogy and say, here's what you're really accepting. And this was a book that really helps me to think, it is okay to question all this stuff when I was firmly on the secular side of this model. So help me, I think it can help you guys talk to your kids or grandkids or whatever for school. So just know I think there's 5 or 6 back there, and if they're gone or anybody else wants one, don't worry, I can get my hands on more real quickly. So creationist people are nice to share. So all right, thank you guys.